Welcome all to this third talk in the seminar series on climate extremes, YCI seminar series on climate extremes this semester. Today's speaker is Christopher Williams from Clark University. Christopher got his PhD from Duke University in 2004, then went on and was a research scientist at CSU, Colorado State University, for about 3 years, I believe, and then went to Goddard, University of Maryland, for a couple of years and was a research scientist there. And in 2008 went to Clark University and is an assistant professor there since then. In planning this seminar series, we became aware of Christopher and his colleagues' work through a New York Times article that I forwarded this morning, and it had the catchy title of Prediction for the Next Century Drought. So we're interested to see the research behind that article. And Christopher, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me in the back? Is it okay? Great. So I just want to thank whoever it was in this room who managed to pull off this series. It's a great pleasure to get to be here to speak with you today. And it's great that we could schedule this between extreme events. I think we have another nor'easter of sorts coming through on Wednesday or so. I was just being told by Trudy. And also thanks, Trudy, for hosting me. So before I get too far along, I want to confess two things. First of all, I changed the title just a bit. And I changed it because this is a presentation. The kernel of this presentation is something that I've delivered in scientific meetings in a 15-minute format. But to try and blow it up to a full seminar, I decided to attempt to provide a broader context from what you would normally get to present as background for the science that we've contributed with this work. So I've changed the title to be a little bit broader: Drought in the American West, Assessing Biophysical and Water Resource Impacts. The other thing I'd like to do is confess that a good fraction of this work was conducted when Christopher Schwalm, now at Northern Arizona University, was a postdoc with me at Clark University. He's there now as a research scientist, and he's actually the one who was first invited. But because he wasn't able to make it, I'm very happy to be able to be here in his place to present his work and our group's work. Kevin Schaefer also deserves some credit. He's at the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Colorado. And there's a broader cast of characters. I can't name everyone today. This work has been partly funded by the National Science Foundation, Atmospheric Sciences, Carbon and Water in the Earth System, a grant awarded to the three of us, as well as some NASA funding that we've drawn upon from terrestrial ecosystems. So I'd like to give them some credit. So this is a story in 5 parts. I'll probably make it through 3, perhaps 4. The first part is about water in the American West, and it will involve a quick lesson, a short lesson in climatology. I'm sure very pedestrian for many of those in the room right now, but I've been told that this can be at times a broad audience, so I'm going to try and provide a backdrop which characterizes the drought in the West that we were detecting within or embedded within a broad dry state. And then what are some of the ways in which the West of the U.S. uses water that might be different from other parts of the country. We'll then move towards a kind of a vignette of an extreme event that happened recently, and then how this was a series of years of unfolding drought that made it remarkable. The next thing is about how it was remarkable in the long-term context, looking back to a 1,000-year tree ring chronology to place this extreme drought event that happened at the turn of this most recent century in a longer historical context. And then we'll look at the future. And we'll do that by focusing on climate model forecasts under high emission scenarios, that is greenhouse gas forcings, because of the fossil fuel driven way of life that we lead today and what that might bring to the future in terms of water availability in the Western United States. And then also there's a global context to that story. We'll be spending the majority of our time on the second piece, which is the science that we've contributed. But by way of background, I just want to introduce from a non-climatologist why the West is dry, in essence, and what that means. So the Western United States is dry by nature. It's dry by nature in such a way that it actually generates a textbook example of the dry humid boundary. This is a graphic simplifying the Köppen-Geiger classification of climate. And it traces a very clear division down the center of the conterminous U.S., separating a region on the left or the west that's quite dry from a region on the east which is relatively humid. How do we define dry? How is this boundary defined? Well, it's really defined by a simple supply and demand. The demand is the atmospheric drying power of the air, that is humidity and wind speed to some degree. There's another component which is the radiant energy input, that is sunlight. And a good proxy for that turns out to be mean annual temperature for these climatological timescales, but even better would be potential evapotranspiration. So that's on the demand side. But what makes a place dry is not just demand for moisture by the atmosphere. Of course, also supply is important, and this is where precipitation comes in. This is not rocket science. The basic idea that mean annual precipitation is a good determinant of just how dry a place tends to be. And also important is its seasonal delivery. Does it fall in a cold season or a warm season? So the combination of these factors is what's used to trace this boundary that separates the west and the east, with a generally dry state in the west. But why is that the case? This is a slide that comes from Lütgens and Tarbuck, and this is a nice example, I think, of how my teaching of weather and climate gets to, there's a broader benefit for my research. This graphic from the textbook The Atmosphere by Lütgens and Tarbuck demonstrates how there's moist, the equatorial heating generates a lot of moist air that rises, generating cloud formation and actually driving an equatorial to poleward circulation system. As everybody here knows, that circulation system isn't one large cell, but in fact, because of radiative cooling in the upper atmosphere, as well as the fact that rainfall essentially is concentrated in the equatorial zone, water rains out, we end up getting a drier upper atmosphere that becomes highly stable, and there's descending air. The Coriolis effect deflects winds, generating what we call the subtropical high pressure zone. This subtropical high pressure zone brings a prevailing state at the surface of dry atmospheric conditions, a dry state. And it just so happens that Western North America is located at a latitude that's consistent with this zonal condition of a subtropical high. There's also a situation in which oceans tend to have strong high pressure systems, and those high pressure systems are stronger on their eastern sides than on their western sides. So the outflow from an anticyclone system here brings maritime tropical air to the eastern side of the continent, keeping it relatively moist on this side, where we don't have that same prevailing condition. We have a strong high pressure system in the ocean and a prevailing dry situation in the western side of the continent. So that's just simple classic climatology. And again, the idea here is that the American West is dry by nature. This simple division is actually a bit more complicated, even than what this would suggest, and this is a map of the Köppen-Geiger classification. B is the dry climate type, and you can notice a prevalence of the dry climate type, which corresponds to desert and steppe conditions. But we also get some interesting seasonally wet, cold season, Mediterranean-type tropical, subtropical ecosystems in parts of California, and then also a marine west coast climate type. So there are some wet regions, but the prevailing condition of the West is one that's dry. You might think that that east-west difference in climate would set up a different pattern in water use between the East and the West. So as I was preparing this seminar, I started to dive into the wonderful data available online about how water is used and aggregating this up to Western and Eastern states. For right now, this is just to mark what I mean by the West. Everything else to the right of that in the conterminous U.S., I'm calling the East. And there are a few interesting points that emerge. First of all, there's a story about the thirsty Western third, I would call it. This is that about 38% of the conterminous U.S. water supply is consumed, but it only has about 28% of the total population. So that's a relatively thirsty average consumption of water. So right now, that's just a comparison of this number and that number relative to the totals. We also see that there's about 5 times as much irrigation, water used and withdrawn for irrigation in the West compared to the East. And furthermore, we get a very stark difference in water use for thermoelectric power. In this dry context, there is hardly any water withdrawn for the generation of electricity, thermoelectric power in the West, 18 times less water use for thermoelectric power generation. So that might lead you to think that at least the energy sector would be buffered from shortages and a dry future in the West. But what do you think it is that gives the West all of its energy? Turns out that hydropower is a very important source that makes up a very big part of the difference. So this is just for the electricity generation alone. But about 40% of the West's electricity is generated from hydropower, very large dams, sometimes small. And this is a very important substitute for other energy sources, things that would require water use for thermoelectric energy production. In the Northwest, it's as high as 70%. So this is a very large fraction of the total water use and of the generation of electricity. So water is still very important for energy generation in the West. And there are actually a couple of significant problems with this fact. First, these large reservoirs lose vast quantities of water to the atmosphere because of the extremely dry state in which they're embedded. You can imagine the atmospheric demand in this arid landscape is very high. You give it a free water surface to draw moisture, and you're going to end up having very large evaporation rates. So that's one problem, and a large fraction of water that flows in these rivers is lost to evaporation. The other problem when it comes to electricity production that I've recently learned about is that shortages in supply, reduced precipitation on catchments in the arid West that are used then for electricity end up becoming amplified in their impacts on electricity. And that's because every drop is used multiple times through a chain of turning turbines. And so this actually underscores a strong dependence and connection between water availability and electricity. You might not see that in any given year if you've got a vast reservoir relative to the amount that's delivered downstream. It may be able to smooth out some of the year-to-year variations, but a long-term change in water availability will clearly translate to a reduced potential for electricity production through hydropower in this region. So that's part of the backdrop. And that led me to think a little bit more about electricity. This being the Climate and Energy Institute, I thought, oh, why not throw up a few energy-oriented statistics? And this was great fun to do into the wee hours of the night. So this is now West and East sources of electricity. And some very stark patterns emerge. The West uses much less coal. It uses much less nuclear for generating electricity. And it uses, of course, a lot more hydroelectric, as I've just motivated or explained. It also uses less energy total on a per unit area basis, right? This is British thermal units adjusted based on the efficiency of production per kilometer square. But when you consider the fraction of US population, this 16% of total and 22% of total looks more similar. So it uses less energy overall, but there are fewer people in the West than the East. So that's part of the story. But again, hydropower is a very key source of electricity, suggesting that droughts would translate or could translate to shortages not just in, say, carbon and drinking water supply, but also electricity production. Now, that's not my research. This is sort of backdrop. There's one other backdrop that I want to mention, which is agriculture. $50 billion a year are generated annually as net farm income. And a good fraction of this, a meaningful fraction, let's say, is contributed by the Central Valley in California and some parts of the West. Now, obviously, the Corn Belt and wheat regions and livestock production and parts of the East generate the lion's share, but let's not underappreciate the importance of, in particular, Californian production. So again, there's this important connection that may be measured in terms of billions of dollars that droughts would bring to this region, this part of the West. So all of that is kind of table dressing for what it is that I want to present to you today, which is an account and an unpacking and an unfolding of a particular drought extreme. This is an event that transpired over the course of about 5 years at the turn of the century and had, I think I'll convince you of, far-reaching carbon, water, and potentially energy consequences. And we want then to think about that and in this long-term history and this future context. So that's where we're headed. At the turn of the century, that is around the year 2000, the Western United States experienced the beginning of what would be a 5-year prolonged moderate drought. I say moderate because over this large domain traced in the red box here, not every place experienced drought in every year, and not every place experienced severe drought, but most places experienced severe drought, and the prevailing condition was dry. This showed up in a variety of indicators. I'm showing here precipitation from the CREW data set. And we can see 3 years prior in blue, a couple of years post in blue, and then the 5-year period of drought. And you can see, in general, below average or average conditions in terms of precipitation. We see below average soil moisture. And these networks are not continuous, and so some of the disagreement could be due to the vagaries and the details of those networks. When it comes to the Palmer Drought Severity Index, we see that especially in 2002, 3, and 4, there was a prevailing condition of a dry state. And that's integrated over the entire Western U.S. domain. I don't know if you can see it, but if you can, these faint gray lines indicate a 1 standard deviation departure from normal. That shows us that when it comes to Palmer Drought Severity Index, while there was a prevailing condition over the region, this was not in any one year severe over the entire region. And we're next going to look at the spatial evolution of this drought each year at a time. All the same, the fact that these happened 1 year after the other had compounding effects. There's a question.
What defines the Palmer Drought Severity Index?
The Palmer Drought Severity Index is a combination of what I mentioned before, supply and demand. Some drought indices, like the SPI, the Standardized Precipitation Index, is all about water shortages from precipitation. And that's a pretty good metric. But there's another side to the drought condition, and that's about atmospheric demand. You can imagine a dry state from an atmosphere that was especially good in 1 year at demanding moisture. And so that demand side is taken also into account with the PDSI. Some other drought indicators don't also consider the drought, the demand side of that equation. There's more to it, and it's an imperfect index. And we can talk about those details, but this is one of the industry standards, the gold standards that's used. So this is a map of the Palmer Drought Severity Index on August 29 of 2000. And you can see a lot of yellows and oranges of varying intensity. And this is the beginning of what would become a 5-year prolonged drought over the region. It wasn't severe over most of the domain. Only a few places experienced severe to extreme drought, but that's still meaningful. But what happened over the next year was a continuation of drought over the region, a prevailing condition. Now, this pattern shifted to the northwest, and it intensified over some regions. You can see a clear belt of intense drought and extreme drought. But other parts of the domain ceased to have as intense a drought. In 2002, about the whole map is experiencing some degree of water shortage, and a large portion of this domain experienced extreme to exceptional drought from a 100-year kind of perspective. In 2003, that continued. So we have yet another year of severe or extreme drought over much of the domain. And into 2004, we saw yet again, in some of the same areas, a significant drought, and again, a lot of reddish and orange colors throughout that domain. So one of the things that I want to impress upon you is how, with this picture, how most of the region experienced at least one red year, okay, 1 year with water shortage. And much of the domain experienced severe drought at some point. In particular, the extent of drought in 2002 in the West only, this domain only, it exceeded the extent of drought during the Dust Bowl for this region. Now, I'm not talking about what's happened on the interior where the Dust Bowl was concentrated, but that's a useful reference for many. People ask me, well, how extreme was this with reference in comparison to the Dust Bowl? For the Western region, it was more severe and more extensive. What did this translate to in terms of water fluxes and carbon balance? Those are the things that we studied the most and work on the most in my lab. And I'm going to show that in 3 different ways here, really. First, I want to focus on the second panel, that is normalized difference vegetation index. Again, the blue dots are 3 years prior or 3 years after, and the 5 red are the turn of the century drought period. And clearly, the vegetation greenness, as seen from satellites, was on average lower, and in some cases much lower than the average outside of this drought period. There's a clear contrast there. We see the same thing when it comes to evapotranspiration. This is evapotranspiration coming from a MODIS-driven product. This is a MODIS-derived evapotranspiration. It's very hard, of course, to get evapotranspiration in continuous format, but satellites provide some indication. And with models coupled to the satellite record, we're able to derive essentially what the evapotranspiration condition was like. We see sizable departures. Again, I apologize if the gray lines are hard to see, but in some years it was well outside 1 standard deviation over a 20-year type period. We used MIRA to look at evaporative fraction, and this is the actual evapotranspiration divided by the potential evapotranspiration. And we see reductions in evaporative fraction. That is, it's commensurate and similar to the reductions in evapotranspiration. Very similar kinds of metrics, different sources of information. And what I think you can see is that there's a corroboration by using many different lines of evidence about the magnitude of this drought and how those 5 years are offset from the prior 3 or the post 3. So that's what we attempted to do, was to provide a comprehensive overarching view of the environmental conditions and the water resource and carbon impacts of this drought. We see.
I'm curious why you don't show us the potential evapotranspiration. Wouldn't that, because your two evaporative fractions, your evapotranspiration curves both dip down, but we don't know whether that's because there's less water to be evaporated or some change in the atmospheric demand.
That's right, but that's part of what evaporative fraction allows us to assess. Because again, it's AET over PET. So an anomaly in AET over PET removes the potential influence of the potential evaporation, and it focuses more on the water supply side. So in combination, these two provide corroborating evidence that it was really water supply, not demand, that caused some of this shock. Yep. Here's looking at the same sort of thing in a spatial context. And now on the left, I'm showing again this vegetation greenness, or NDVI. In the middle, we have a soil moisture product, and we have the Palmer Drought Severity Index on the right. What's shown here is drought minus non-drought conditions. So that is the 5-year average for the drought minus the prior 3 plus post 3 average. And you can see there's a lot of red. That's the main story. And that overall, there's a coherent water shortage that showed up in reduced greenness of vegetation, reduced soil moisture on average, and a negative anomaly in the Palmer Drought Severity Index. So we see that there's a coherence spatially, but also across data sets. Now we're going to turn to a different data source, which is another way of looking at the same kind of problem. The impact of the drought is now going to be assessed using hydrologic gauging stations, and these are data from the USGS available at their WaterWatch site. I have some animation here. Okay, so for these major basins, we have 6 major river basins: the Pacific Northwest, California, Great Basin, Lower Colorado, Upper Colorado, and the Rio Grande. So for these 6 basins, we want to know what the river flow anomalies were like. Did they experience reduced river flows? I'll show in just a moment that there were large reductions. So now we're showing again 1997 to 2007 or 8, so 2007, years prior, years post, and our drought period. There's clearly a reduction in total runoff, a change in annual runoff across all of the 6 major river basins that's very well offset from the 3 years prior and the 3 years post. The Upper Colorado and the Lower Colorado were some of the most impacted. They experienced the most severe and continuous droughts. And so you see, while they may not have had the largest total reductions, the Upper Colorado, for example, had sustained reduction. In some cases, runoff was reduced by about 50% from normal. This is a pretty sizable reduction from the average condition, where in this case the average is calculated as the mean across all of these years. Okay. So this is, again, a clear drought minus non-drought contrast. And this is showing the same kind of picture, but now spatially. So we've got 2000 in the upper left, 2001 in the bottom left, 02 in the middle, and so forth. What's shown here is red is the percentile relative to a 110-year historical record of river flows. And if it's a less than 10, that means it's less than 10th percentile. We see a large fraction of the country experiencing much reduced river flows, especially in 2002. And these are, of course, consistent with the kinds of spatial patterns that we saw year in, year out as the drought, the 5-year drought, evolved. We saw the shift to the northwest in 2001. We saw a strong interior signal in 02 and in 03, and it persisted even in 04. So 3 years of low runoff, especially in the upper Colorado and lower Colorado river basins. So we see it spatially, and now we can look at it in a tabular format with some basic statistics. We're just going to look at ranks. And in this case, I'm reporting the 5-year average flow for each of the basins, and it's in fact, it's the number of years with a 5-year average flow that was lower than the average during the turn of the century drought. And you can see that in a 110-year record, the upper Colorado and the lower Colorado never had a year with lower 5-year average runoff. So this was a record-breaking event for those, in particular, those two basins. We see it was also record-breaking for most of the basins. The Rio Grande is showing there was only one 5-year average that was lower than this. We see that even in the California, it was ranked as the 10th lowest. So it's low overall, especially in some basins. And we can also start to look at whether or not historical droughts of note were captured in the same records. I won't go into detail except to say the 80s droughts were in some basins. The Dust Bowl was clearly evident in the Great Basin and actually California as well. The 50s and 60s droughts showed up in those same basins. And so it's not that these were the turn of the century drought was the only major one, but notice in the places where the other droughts were significant, it modified the statistics. The rank wasn't as low. But these were real records for the Colorado basins especially.
Excuse me.
Yes?
So how confident can we be about that time series, that century time series?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I'm the best one to answer that. The people who procure the data and make them available say that back to the 1930s is where we have the most confidence. So I'm going to go on faith and trust their intuition for that. Anything prior is more questionable. It turns out that in the West and across much of the country, prior to the 1930s was a relatively wet period. And so I don't think we would have missed a lot of dry end statistics from that first 30 years of record here. Sorry, I can't give you a more satisfying answer, but state of my knowledge. So another way to look at this is what was the rank of the single lowest runoff of the 5 years of drought? And we see in the upper Colorado and lower Colorado, the year 2000 was the lowest ever. This is now just single year, not 5-year average. So forget the consecutive nature. 2002 was also in the lower Colorado the third lowest runoff ever. Third lowest in the Pacific Northwest in 2001 when it experienced that shift to the northwest. In California, the lowest year was the 7th lowest in 2001. And in the Rio Grande, it was the 5th lowest in 2003. Again, showing in general that there was a coherence about some condition of drought that was exceptional and record-breaking when we think about this in a century-long context. So water resources are one of the things we were thinking about, but crop yield is another one. We were curious, well, what was the impact on crop yield, especially knowing how important that is for livelihoods in the region. Showing our characteristic blues and reds over the 97 to 07 period, we see that crop production over the region showed a large decline, particularly in the year 2002. Now, recall in your mind, if you can, the distribution of agricultural production in the region. It's largely concentrated in California, and so there was significant drought in the Central Valley part in this year 2002, which is why that was the large negative reduction, or large negative anomaly, about 13% compared to the average. We also see this in terms of the PDF, or the frequency distribution of county level normalized productivity. So this is crop yield at a county level for 2,383 counties, I think it was. And you see the distribution during the drought shifted to the left relative to the non-drought conditions. Not every county experienced a significant drought in all of these years. Some of them had banner years, but most of them did not. And here's a spatial look at that context. This is now crop productivity expressed as net primary productivity. It's the relative difference compared to the non-drought mean, drought minus non-drought. And I'll just point out the orange in red. There's an awful lot of yellow and even some green. Green is above average. But there's quite a lot of red and orange, particularly in this domain, just indicating that there were as much as 30% mean reductions in crop yield for some places. Another source of information that allows us to quantify the impact of this drought is this network that I work with quite a lot, Flux Network. Professor Lee here works also with Flux quite a bit, so you might already be familiar with these towers. But here's a picture from one of the sites at which I've worked. That's actually Skakusa, South Africa in the Kruger Park. But it's indicative of the kinds of sensors that we have. This is at about 35 meters off the ground, a sonic anemometer pointing out to the upwind direction and measuring at 20 hertz or 10 hertz the three directions of velocity. It also measures carbon dioxide and water concentration and temperature with a whole set of fast response sensors. The covariance, the mean covariance over an averaging period, allows us to measure the mass exchange between surface and atmosphere of water, carbon dioxide, heat, sensible heat, as well as momentum. And so there is a network of these globally. It's sparse, it's biased in its representation across the globe, but one place where we do happen to have you could say a ring of sensors that can be used as a network is throughout the Western United States. And so each red dot is one tower, each blue dot is a numbered number of towers, 2, 2, or 3. And what we did was something kind of unusual, which is to say we know not every place experienced drought in every year, but let's look at whether or not this network of flux towers detected a measurable effect of this coherent drought, this large-scale drought, pooling them as an observatory. And I think you'll see that we found this to be a pretty successful technique. This network is composed of data contributed by a heterogeneous number of investigators, each with site-level funding. The Department of Energy has supported this through the Ameriflux funding that they provide. But the site PIs deserve a lot of credit for contributing these data for syntheses of this sort. Here's the kind of thing that we saw. We're going to first look at the baseline condition. This is the average non-drought condition. Busy graphic. The first three terms, NEP, GPP, and ecosystem respiration, are carbon flux terms. That is, ecosystem carbon fluxes. The next two are energy balance terms, energy flux terms, I should say, latent energy flux and sensible heat flux, which will be familiar for many. We're showing this for classes of vegetation types that were detected or measured by these flux towers. The flux towers have a kilometer scale footprint that shifts with wind direction. And so it's a fairly local measure, and these tend to be located in a place where we know the vegetation cover, its characteristics, and so forth. We have 8 towers that measured the exchanges for evergreen needle-leaf forests, 4 towers in grasslands, and 3 towers in woody savannas. And what we're showing here is the aggregation of those over the observational network, again for the baseline period. So starting on the bottom left, we have net ecosystem productivity. This is shown in grams of carbon per square meter per year. And we see a reassuring pattern. Well, let me start by saying net ecosystem productivity is closest to the measured carbon flux, but we can separate that into primary productivity and ecosystem respiration with a technique I'd be happy to tell you about later. But what it does is it shows us some, first of all, reassuring patterns. Evergreen needle-leaf forests tend to be in the wetter places that also have higher productivity. And so, indeed, we see that productivity in these evergreen needle-leaf forests exceeds that of the drier grasslands as well as the savannas, the woody savanna types. Another reassuring pattern of a sort is that when it comes to evaporation, we see that grasslands, this orange bar, tend to be pretty water use intensive. That's a classic characteristic habit of grasses and their water use strategy. Use it or lose it is a little bit more like the grass habit. And it turns out that indeed they do generally use more water through evapotranspiration than the typical use for a forest or a woody savanna, the woodier types. So there's a lot of detail in these slides, and I'm not going to have a chance to go through everything. But what I'm now going to do is say, well, how is the drought, the 5-year drought period, different from this baseline condition? So this is the anomaly. And it's calculated as the fluxes during the drought minus the baseline average. So these are the anomalies, same terms, same color bars. And now what we see is a few prevailing patterns. First of all, in 2 of the 3 ecosystem types, we see significant reductions in productivity, in net ecosystem productivity. We see both gross primary productivity, that is primary production and CO2 sequestration through photosynthesis. We see that decreasing. We also see a decrease in ecosystem respiration. But the decrease in plant productivity exceeds the decrease in respiration, and so there ends up being a net lost uptake of carbon. That's what this negative sign of NEP means. That is, if you think it's good that ecosystems mitigate greenhouse gas pollutions through pulling CO2 down, that was reduced. That effect was reduced, particularly in forests and grasslands. We didn't see that effect in woody savannas. That's an interesting outcome. You can think about why that might be the case, but my story is that microbes don't have deep roots, but plants do. Okay? Woody savannas have deep roots. Microbes are the source of a lot of the decomposition and the release of CO2 to the atmosphere. The microbes and the carbon that they consume tends to be concentrated in the upper soils that dries out during these droughts. And so respiration, this is well reported, respiration declines and plummets, especially in dry places. Meanwhile, woody savannas have deep roots. They access a much larger volume of soil water, and they have reserves and strategies that allow them to carry over productivity to some degree during droughts. So the absence of deep roots for microbes is one of the explanations for why woody savannas had actually an increased uptake. Yes?
I don't know what we call woody savanna in California. I wonder about the vegetation type. Would there be a higher percentage of C4 plants, sort of like in African savanna?
There's not a lot of C4 in this part of the world. Great question. You could see, because of the water use intensivity of C3 versus C4, some interesting patterns that would emerge, but there's not a lot of C4 here. When it comes to evaporation, we saw also decreases, that's this LEF term in watts per meter squared, radiative term, or an energy term. We see decreases across the board. The baseline was something like 28 or so. The percentages are here, excuse me. 25% reduction in evaporation in evergreen needle-leaf forests, more modest in grasslands. Again, they're water use intensive. And then a 16% reduction in the woody savannas. We also saw, not shown here, an increase in air temperatures. That's measured at these flux towers as well. And there was generally a 0.4 degree Celsius increase on average during the summer season, I should have said, for this particular set of sites. And then lastly, we see an interesting pattern in sensible heat flux. In grasslands, it decreased. There was less sensible heat flux. It increased in the other two. What would you expect? If evaporation is going down, you would expect sensible heat's got to go up, right? The energy goes somewhere. And that's what you would generally see, except in grasslands, they're neat. They're different. They're different because they senesce and they become white. And their albedo increases dramatically. They also show more soil, so the total net radiation energy available in input into the system can decrease. That's a pretty well-known and well-reported kind of phenomenon. So it's interesting, it's neat that the network also detected that kind of effect. So this is simply to say that we also see a large reduction in primary productivity and net carbon uptake that would otherwise offset the carbon emissions associated with, say, fossil fuel dependence. There's another thing we can do with this. We can try to scale up to the aggregate area averaged total carbon uptake in the baseline condition in these ecosystems, and then how it was reduced during the drought. That's what we're showing here. This is for gross primary productivity for 2 terms, but I'm going to jump down to the net ecosystem productivity. And there are 2 ways in which we can look at this. One is with atmospheric inversions. transport tracer inversions, and CO2 flask network, and then by using the flux tower data themselves. I want to focus first on the baseline sink, and we're seeing that in general the inversions suggest, the atmospheric inversions suggest that about 100 to 200, let's say 150 to 200 teragrams of carbon per year are taken up in the average condition in the western United States by ecosystems. There are other things that might contribute, but it really looks like the missing sink in this region is sizable and it's of that magnitude. The question is, how was it reduced? How big was the reduction during the drought period? Turns out it was about 30 to 83, depending on source. This is, I remember that the top line is for Carbon Tracker, if you know these. The bottom line is for Christian Rodenbeck's Jena inversion from the Max Planck Biogeochemistry Institute there. But I think what's most reliable and important is the percentage differences. We see that 17 to 44%, depending on data source with these inversions, 17 to 44% reductions in this carbon uptake, which is the baseline condition. That's a significant number. That's a sizable number. Now, we can get a similar number, 48%, using the flux tower network. But the raw data, the absolute values are quite different. Why is that? Which one should we trust? Well, the jury's out, but we suspect as flux tower users that there are large sources, releases of carbon dioxide that are not well detected by the flux tower network. And so these numbers, this seems implausible to me, working in the global carbon cycle. 623 teragrams of carbon, half a petagram of carbon. If you work in the carbon cycle, that's a large number. Global deforestation is about annually about 1 to 2 petagrams of carbon per year. Global land change emissions. So this is about half of that to a third of that. That's a large number. And just for the US West, that's implausible. But what I think the network does do is provide a good relative measure, say a 48% reduction. I think we get more confidence in that number. So I want you to be careful, and I'm careful in the way I use these numbers, but I think that's more reliable. But that's not the whole story. There was also a large uptick in fire emissions associated with this drought event. Here we have from the Landsat-derived monitoring trends and burn severity mapping of the area of forests based on the USGS data, a 1984 to 2008 record of burned area. And this is shown by category and year. Category is low, medium, and high severity fires. And what you can clearly see is that the average over that full record is this black line, and during the turn of the century drought, the height of bars is high relative to that average. And perhaps an even better reference would be the average during this pre-turn of the century drought. You can see that fire emissions were far larger. Well, this is now area, but this translates pretty directly into fire emissions. Here it is in terms of fire emissions. The size of the blue bar increased because high severity fires emit more than low severity fires. So there's a disproportionate impact on carbon release. And this is from some of the work of Bardhan Gamiri, a PhD student of mine, who's just recently published this in JGR Biogeosciences. We calculated a roughly 25 teragram of carbon additional release per year due to an uptick in fires. Was this due only to the drought? Or do you maybe see a general trend of an increase in fire area and emissions? There is, and it's not just during the drought. In fact, these were not especially dry years across the region, but fire emissions were also large then. And we generally see a sizable increase in fire emissions across this region that's taking place today. So that's part of the story as well. And then just to wrap up this vignette of the full impacts of this particular drought, what's been happening recently is also relevant. Part of what gave a lot of attention to the work that we've recently published was the fact that when it was released, it was published in July of 2012, the country was undergoing a significant and severe drought, very much like, in extent, the Dust Bowl. Now, it extended well into the interior in ways that the turn of the century drought didn't necessarily. But if you look at the West, the Western U.S. experienced, again, another whammy of a year in terms of low runoff, water shortages, and associated impacts. And so one could ask, well, with all of these droughts going on and these sizable impacts that are meaningful in a lot of ways, how does this fit into the broader long-term context? is this unusual for the area or is it commonplace? And so that's where we're going to transition to the third element of the talk, which is about a 1,000-year history. And if you're worried about time, these get progressively shorter. So the 1,000-year history is a context from a long tree ring chronology developed by Ed Cook. Not our work, but again, it's backdrop and context for the sorts of things we're studying. And it tells a simple story that it used to be drier than today, or at least a recent yesterday. This is a busy way of showing the texture of the data from the tree ring chronology. But this is the way we presented it, again, based on Ed Cook's work from the Lamont Doherty Observatory. This arrow indicates the 5-year average Palmer drought severity reconstruction from that tree ring chronology. And some tree rings do indeed go back as far as 1,200 years into the past. Now we get progressively fewer trees, and corresponding as we go back in time, and we should have progressively increased concern or skepticism or caution in the way we use the data as we go back in time. But what's clear is when we would, let's say I believe that this is the best record we can get, but if we were to go back to about 1600 when we have greater confidence in the record, you can see that there was one 5-year average drought or PDSI condition that was similar in magnitude to that in 2000. And in fact, there were only 4 events in this 1,200-year historical context that were as large or larger. When did those occur? It happened long into the past, 800 to about 1100 and 1200 to 1300. We were talking a little bit about this with Carl. Well back into the past, medieval warm period sorts of times, if we're correct. The Stein 1 and Stein 2, this is a long time into the past. We don't really know what caused that. It wasn't greenhouse gas forcing. But clearly, there was a dry period in the distant past. And I think that Ed Cook's graphic provides an even better illustration of the same time series. The raw texture of the data is overlain by some kind of spline. I don't know the time scale of that, but it clearly indicates, now in this case, let me explain. This is percent drought area across this domain of the West, very similar domain. And so positive means drier, negative or lower on the graph, reductions is wetter. And you can see that during this period of what they called mega droughts, the West was a lot drier. And more recently, we've had a good fortune of a relatively wet period. And in fact, as I was suggesting before, in the early 1900s, it was a very wet West compared to this long record. Just so happens that that's when we were exploring and setting up all sorts of contracts for water usages. And today's reality over-allocates the water on an annual basis because a lot of those contracts were drawn up in a relatively pluvial period. Another thing that we can see with the recent record is a strong return towards dry conditions very much like those of the mega droughts long ago. And so in general, in this part of the country, it's been getting drier and drier throughout the 20th century. So that's the 1,000-year historical context. And now we want to turn to the future to see if it happened in the past with what's likely to come if we don't change our fossil fuel dependence, what might there be to pass? And this title that Trudy mentioned is 100-Year Forecast Drought. We didn't choose that title. The New York Times did, of course. But I think it's still true to the message. And I changed it to Drier Than We'd Like. This comes now from the CMIP-5 multi-model ensemble average normalized precipitation, again, selected for this particular domain, the same domain we've been looking at, and it spans 1900 to 2100. The turn of the century drought is right in the middle. And you can see that indeed the models suggest, just like the data, that in general there's a trend towards less wet conditions, and under a high emission scenario that's expected to get worse and worse and worse over the next 100 years. So, right, this was with the representative concentration pathway 8 or 8 watts per meter squared. And this is from Meal et al. So we simply used that recent data source and detected or observed that there are a few important points here. First of all, the turn of the century drought was exceptional relative to the 20th century. It was a major drought, unparalleled, according to the models and also relative to the observational records. And what is it likely to, how does it stand in the future climatology? It stands out as a wet anomaly. In fact, a wet anomaly that doesn't happen, according to the models, by the mid to late 21st century. So it was a major drought that stands out similar to the mega droughts of 1,000 years ago. And with greenhouse forcing, it's suggested, according to the models, that we will not see a wet condition as wet as the turn of the century drought.
Chris, can you just clarify where do we switch over from
Model.
data to model here, or is it all model? It's model. What are the dates?
This is all.
Sorry?
What are the dates, sir?
Well, for example, the dates when you're in the future, are they models driven by greenhouse gas forcing only, or are there other things that might set particular dates in the future?
Yeah. So I don't know, just for the audio and video, the question is, well, was this all model-based, and where do we transition, as well as what were the dates of some of the drivers of the patterns that we would see in the models, including greenhouse gas forcings and other things? Well, prior to, I don't know what the exact boundary is, but let's say it's maybe 2010, we have an observed history of fossil fuel emissions and some other observational constraints that were used to help drive the models. Okay, so that's one piece. Going forward, of course, there's an emission scenario, which is now actually a concentration in the atmosphere, and that's this RCP 8 watts per meter squared. In the CMIP5, we have a different approach. It's not, or the modelers have a different approach. It's not A1B, A2, and B1 any longer. It's a concentration pathway, concentration in the atmosphere. And that's what would run forward from about 2010. Is there another question there? Maybe I didn't capture.
That they almost probably also have aerosol emissions variant.
Right. So there was a comment about how aerosol variation into the future is also part of what these models would be projecting and forecasting. It's not just greenhouse gas.
Forcings are smooth forcings. And so all of the raggedness there is a random
Yes.
kind of internal
Yes. Now,
noise generated within the model. Isn't that
right. Now I see what you're getting at. The point is,
You wouldn't necessarily predict the drought, say, in 2060 based on that curve.
right.
That's what I'm driving at.
That's right. So I think the point is that while there's greenhouse gas and other aerosol type forcings, atmosphere composition forcings, the question is partly what gives rise to the year-to-year variation and the swings and the anomalies that we see in this record. It's internal variability within the model system, the climate system. Is it smack on for any given year? No, I don't think so. Is the range of variability consistent with that which has been observed over the 20th century? Yes, it is. We tested that. We evaluated a quantile plot of precipitation anomalies over the West, and we saw that the model is fidelitous to the data. That is, that it reproduces the range of variability and the statistical extremes of precipitation for the 20th century, suggesting that it's capable of capturing year-to-year variations and natural variability that's not forced by punctuated emissions. It's a smooth emissions and atmosphere concentration profile. What we didn't have in our work, because the data weren't yet fully available, but I'd like to point out is the spread across models. This is now back to a paper by Richard Seeger, also at Lamont Doherty, with the CMIP3 archive. And the results are anyway very similar to what we see with CMIP5. Not that much has changed in the models or the way they're run. And the pink envelope is what I'm going to point out. First of all, this is now precipitation minus evaporation. It's a little bit different from just precipitation. But what we see is an envelope, the 25th is 75th percentile high end and 25th percentile low end across the models around a multi-model mean, which I'm sorry, it's the red line. Okay. And it just indicates the range of variability across models, which I think also underscores the degree to which the year-specific precision is not clear in the models, nor would it be expected to be. But the range of variability in the pink envelope is really the spread between models and the way their internal variability evolves. There's sensitivity dependent to initial conditions and so forth. Also different model physics, model structure, all of that feeds into the spread that we see here. Another thing that I must admit I don't fully understand is that the range of variability across models gets increasingly large. Part of that is just that the model physics, the model structure is different. The strength of feedbacks with the same emissions forcing, the same concentrations in the atmosphere, that changes. And there's the classic spread and amplification associated with how models differ. But in general, notice that they all show a trend towards reduced precipitation minus evaporation, or reduced precipitation, if you will, throughout the western domain. And here's the same data source presented spatially and by season. This is now precipitation or percent change, less precipitation in brown, more in blue, shown in winter, spring, summer, and fall from top left to lower right. This is from Michael Weiner in the US GCRP, the Global Change Research Program's report in 2009. And the hatching indicates places where there's a multi-model confidence regarding the magnitude or agreement about the sign and magnitude of these changes. We can see that some parts of North America get wetter in winter, but certainly some parts are expected to get drier. The exact boundary is not well described. We don't know where that boundary should be. In spring and summer, though, we see a general coherence and confidence across models, particularly here in the Northwest and here in the Southwest, that there will be precipitation reductions. We could expect that with a high emissions scenario going forward. This is again based on CMIP3, but it's showing us a story that's consistent with the concerns that we observed regarding the context of the turn of the century drought, what it looks like in the past and what it could be in the future. So that's what led us to think about taking the New York Times up on their invitation to write an opinion piece, which felt like a very daunting and frightening thing to do. And Christopher Schwalm, myself, and Kevin Schaefer co-wrote this during our vacations over the summer. It just felt too important. It felt like we had to sound an alarm that has been sounded before, but that is a clear future that I think we could all agree we wouldn't want if we could avoid it without too many costs. That's a big if. And in the process of writing this, we came across in our interactions with the general public and even some scientists what I classified as 4 major arguments that challenge the conclusions, or should we care, can we believe in it? And I just wanted to share those with you. I don't have answers to every single one, but I think some of them are actually easy to defend and maybe even the wrong questions or challenges. The first is that the 1,000-year history was drier. Dry is a normal condition in the West, and that the 20th century has actually been pretty wet. So why are we so worried about drought? Why are we worried about this future? I think clearly we can see that a return to the dry condition of 1,000 years ago in the next 100 years would bring a radically altered, a dramatically different average condition in the West that probably wouldn't be habitable and used in the same way. So I don't know if that's a reasonable challenge, but interesting observation indeed. The second is that natural variability is large, and past droughts were even caused without human forcing. So the year-to-year variations, and probably even the turn-of-the-century drought, which gets on to the next point, we couldn't attribute them directly to greenhouse gas forcing, and most of them are driven by natural variability, connections to El Nino and La Nina type conditions, here La Nina, or the PDO, the AMO, all sorts of teleconnections in the atmosphere. And isn't that what's driving droughts? So perhaps we shouldn't be as concerned. So that's another challenge, and I'll get to that with a sort of a parry in the next slide. And then lastly, climate models are forecasts. They're flawed models. They have biases. They have spread. And so why should we alter our behavior today given all of these uncertainties? They're error-prone and uncertain. And it's especially so when it comes to drought predictions. So I agree that that's a concern, but when all the models are pointing in a similar direction about a change in the climate, not just in the American Southwest, but globally, I think maybe there's still reason to be concerned. And here's part of my, in a sense, explanation for why I agree this is hard to assimilate and understand. I myself have trouble getting my head around it, but here's a working hypothesis as I come to think about climate change more and more. Back to the same record. You can see that natural variability is large and real, and that there were droughts of the past. But what's happening with greenhouse gases, as we all know here, is that they're accumulating into the atmosphere. And that makes it really hard when you're sitting right here to understand what the impacts will be like in the future. To take the past 60 years of significant fossil fuel emissions and greenhouse gases accumulating in the atmosphere, see modest, scientifically defendable, but somewhat modest resource impacts, and then think about the wall that's coming, which is an accumulated compounding effect of the next 60 years of emissions. It's very hard for us to think about an exponential landscape. It's hard enough linearly, but when the wall that's coming is very steep, as it is in this case, when it's accumulating, and in fact accumulating not even linearly, but it's growing in a curvilinear shape and sticking around for a long time, say a 100-year average lifetime for a CO2 molecule, assuming that sinks behave the same in the future. This has a long-lasting effect and a compounding effect because of accumulation in the atmosphere, and that makes it very hard to think about even a significant drought today that cannot be unambiguously attributed to greenhouse gases, nor have we tried to. But to place that into context as a representation of what's likely to come with a continued path of fossil fuel dependence in our way of life, that's a hard problem to wrap your head around. I admit that. But it seems clear that not only are we talking about a drier future, but we're not even talking about droughts anymore. The natural variability remains, but look at the progression of the future. Natural variability is still large. In fact, maybe it gets larger. Maybe that's partly because of the multi-model ensemble. But even when you have that natural variability, which is what we usually think about as droughts, we're talking about a transition in what's climate normal. We're not really talking about droughts anymore. So if we think that it was bad in the turn of the century drought and unparalleled, we need to think differently about whether that's even a reasonable analog for what it could be like in the future throughout this region. And so I'll return to this slide, which is that yes, the West, the US West is dry by nature, but it could become, without a change in our fossil fuel dependence, an even drier future because of humans. And it's an intensification of the Hadley cell, an expansion of the subtropical high, a shift towards the poles, and a stronger, drier kind of condition that prevails over the Western US. And then very quickly, global outlook. Is this only in the Western US or is it a global challenge? Looks like it's a global challenge. The models are, as we've all heard, suggesting that dry places globally could become drier. The hatching is again places with multi-model confidence, 9 out of 11 of the CMIP5 models that were used by Aiguo Dai in a recent Nature Climate Change paper. And sure, we see a strong pattern in the Western US domain that we're thinking about, but there are many other parts of the planet where precipitation shortages, soil moisture shortages, and the attendant and commensurate impacts on water resources used by humans, agricultural production, and so forth, could be challenged unless something was to change. So with that, my conclusions are just that this turn of the century drought was significant. It was a 5-year anomaly and one of the largest in the past millennium. It caused a large reduction in water availability, and we see this in multiple lines of evidence. It reduced the region's productivity in a substantial way, and this offset some of the typical carbon uptake for that region, which in fact would be I didn't talk about it, but a positive feedback to the amplification of warming if this was greenhouse driven. And forecasts suggest that this could be the wet end of a future 21st century climate if we stay on a high emissions future scenario. So with that, I just want to return to some acknowledgments. Again, the National Science Foundation and NASA and the Department of Energy, and thank the hosts for having me here to deliver this seminar. Thanks.
Questions for Christopher? Ron?
Can I ask one more? Sorry.
Please.
Is there any consensus on the CMIP people about why those areas are getting drier? Why in the models
Yeah.
those areas are getting drier? Is there a unified view on that?
I don't know if it's unified, and I don't think I would represent that view well, not being a climate modeler or even a climatologist. My simple-minded understanding is it's essentially an intensification of the Hadley cell, circulation, an expansion of that domain, and basically you add energy to the system, and it intensifies the circulation cell and intensifies the subtropical high zone. Now, I don't understand it further than that. We were talking about this with Carl and Trudy before. And in fact, is it John? You and I started to touch on that topic a little bit. So I'd love to learn from this community about whether or not there's consensus about the mechanism driving that.
I have a sort of climate model related question as well. You said, so they're associated with these droughts that could become a lot more frequent in the future. There's changes in carbon uptake by vegetation, changes in albedo, changes in forest fires, and so when you combine the climate effect of all that, it's not clear to me what the net effect would be, and I'm not sure to what extent those effects are all included in climate models. I don't know if you know. I know that the climate models have improved in terms of carbon cycle and so on. So I was wondering to what extent that's part of the future scenario for the.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of positive and perhaps even negative feedback effects that are missing from the climate models. One of the most significant that I think about is the permafrost carbon feedback. Now, that may not show up for 100 years anyway, as my colleague Kevin Schaefer has worked on quite a lot to suggest, but it is going to be large as a stored future consequence. So the models aren't perfect. They don't have everything in them. When it comes to some of the major drivers, I think they're actually not bad. Now, again, I want to point out that the pink shading got larger over time across models. That's because each model has its own internal dynamics. They end up creating a widening envelope of the future projections. So that's fodder for and fuel for additional research, some of which I'd like to contribute to in my work on the land carbon cycle. A lot of it lies in just what happens to, say, the Amazon and drought-stricken forests. And models do very different things with respect to the water cycle and its impacts on the carbon cycle. The albedo effect we could certainly improve, but I think that those models have the best data have been brought to bear on how we treat surface albedo with a changing climate in terms of hydrology and water status, its influence on albedo, surface albedo. And in fact, interestingly, land cover change generates CO2 emissions and a greenhouse gas forcing, but also, in general, the past land cover changes and many of the future cause a more reflective surface. And so these things act in opposite directions. So looking backwards, land cover change has, we believe, had a net cooling effect because the albedo forcing outweighs the greenhouse gas forcing going in different directions. So that is all in the models insofar as we understand them today. One of the problems is that, of course, we have understanding in specific places, but we don't know about it everywhere. So there's work to be done. But a lot of the major mechanisms are, I think, in there. One last thing is, again, not my area of expertise, but I understand that clouds are a major unknown. And how clouds will evolve and change in the future, their direct radiative effects based on whether they're low or high in the atmosphere, that's a big unknown, and that's another major source of uncertainty in the way this climate models would make projections. So I don't know I know not everything is in there, and I know they're spread in part due to all of these uncertain mechanisms. But just one last thing is that they clearly show that accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will drive these regions to a drier future. And there's agreement about that.
Other questions? If not, let's thank you.
Thank you.